The Boy from Yesterday. Before we start with Chapter 22, I just want to remind everyone to please leave a rating or a question or a comment wherever you find your podcast. A rating will help us to spread the word about our story and to help share it around the world with people who might enjoy it. And now, Chapter 22, Chesterfield Memorial Park. As cemeteries go, this one was beautiful. The statuary was both old and new. There were some big white mausoleums and statues of angels. There were old and new headstones and various plants and bushes that bloomed in the spring air. The whole place had a timeless quality to it, and one could read headstones that were hundreds of years old, next to plots where the headstones contained dates that were only a few years old. There were so many for such a small town, and it was one of the few places in Chesterfield that was a living testament to the small city's history and its past vibrance when the mills of New England were thriving. Laurel looked around as they entered the old front black wrought-iron gate of the historic cemetery, trying to find something familiar among the many tombstones, seeing all kinds of names and dates, but not finding anything familiar. As she walked along, Tom following, they came to a spot on the far side near a large white stone statue of an angel with a large wingspan, with his arms outstretched to the sky, near a grassy area that was empty of headstones. There were many lights along the main path like street lights, and the full moon gave plenty of light. There was no caretaker on duty in a cemetery in the size of Chesterfield at night, so they made themselves at home looking around, not really knowing what they were looking for. Tom knew the place a little bit. He took in the sight of so many headstones now than at the time that he knew it, although he spotted the area a ways away where his parents were buried, and others that had died of yellow fever. But there were so many stones now, and it was daunting to think of all the people who died and were buried here since his time. He was almost afraid to look around, fearing he might see stones from people he knew as alive and well in his time. Tom looked to his left toward the front gate, just taking a broad survey of the stones and noticing some names on the headstones that he didn't recognize, many of which had birth dates in the early 1900s and death dates in the late 1970s and early 1980s. His heart ran a bit faster seeing so many stones with so many dates that came well after his time, realizing that there were whole lifetimes, many of them in fact, that came between his time and Laurel's, much like the feeling he had at the campus, realizing the buildings that had been built. He felt he was disconnected to the time he came from, until he turned back to his right, walking in an area he thought originally was bare of headstones, then saw one in particular very plainly right in front of him. It was a fairly large, beautiful white stone that was somewhat weathered, but the engraved name and dates were still deep and black. His eyes widened and he gasped what he saw. Philip Hurd, M.D., born January 15, 1840, died February 28, 1912. "Laurel," he called, waving her over to him, but still not taking his eyes off the stone, walking over to feel the letters as if he didn't believe them by just looking at them. "What did you find?" Laurel said as she rushed over. She looked at the stone. "Who's Philip Hurd?" "That's our town doctor," Tom said. "In my time, we only had one in town. Dr. Hurd was him. He was taking care of Sam when I left. That means there must be more around here. Maybe Sam's is here. Laurel, what do we do if we find Sam's? What if this is all that's left of him?" Tom started looking around the area quickly, frantically, checking the names and dates on various stones, all with dates that varied widely. Laurel looked around too. She knew that while this was one way to get some information on what at least happened in the past as they knew it, she wasn't sure if Tom going back home to his time might change things in the future with his intervention. Or did it matter? How were the rules of time travel going to work? Laurel only knew how time travel had worked in certain movies and TV shows, and assumed that at the time they were all fiction. Now that she knew it was possible, as Tom was there with her, she wondered how else the rules of time travel would apply. As much as she wanted to find out something, anything that might help them, she was also anxious about it. She should have been anxious, for what she found next made her stand still, and instantly her throat choked up and she held back tears. only long enough to say quietly, "Tom, I think you should see this." Tom could tell by the sound of her voice that it was something important. Laurel was frozen with her hand to her mouth, blushing with the red heat in her cheeks of trying to suppress tears. Tom followed her to where Laurel was looking, on a stone off to the corner, near a small cluster of other stones in the corner of the cemetery yard. Samuel Oliver Beckins, born February 8th, 1871, died April 28th, 1890. Beloved son. Tom stood frozen as well as the nighttime breeze grew colder. Tom could only stare and breathe. Finally he shook his head and said, I didn't make it. I didn't save him. Laurel just hugged him as Tom started to weep as well. Then Laurel saw another stone over Tom's shoulder nearby, behind and beside Sam's. She saw its inscription, Thomas Beckins, born April 4th, 1893, died March 8, 1967. She looked around it, pulling away from Tom a bit, as Tom wiped his eyes, wondering why she was pulling away. She saw another stone next to it, James T. Beckins, born 1917, died 1995. And next to that one, Elizabeth Butts Beckins, 1917 to 1997. And another, Oliver Nathan Beckins, 1917 to 1944, hero forever in our hearts. Laurel turned back to the headstone of Sam. She looked closely at it this time, for the date of death seemed to blur, and she could no longer read it. She knew it had said April 24th, 1890, but the letters of the A-P-R-I-L were swirling like sand in the hard stone, and occasionally she made out that they said May, then March, then a long February. "Tom, look," she said as she pointed to the stone with the swirling letters. "What's happening? It's moving!" Tom looked at the letters, squinted, and took a step closer. "How can that be? What is it doing?" Laurel looked up and back around where the other stones were. Only this time the stones weren't there at all, only a deep, thick grass that led to the corner fence of the cemetery yard. "I don't like this," Laurel said. "Something is going on." "What do we do?" Tom said. "I think we better leave. Something is changing, apparently. It must have something to do with the time continuum. We better just get back for now and research more tomorrow about the magic words." "All right," Tom said, this time leading Laurel by the hand out the path back to the front gate and outside the cemetery back toward Marguerite's house. The breeze blew Tom's hair, and Laurel's too, which reminded Tom of the time in the transition tunnel. They were both hungry, but the feeling in their pit of their stomachs was something much more.